charts you get to look at today. Looks pretty complicated, huh? This one's for a Lockheed Constellation. I have no idea how to do it. This is more typical of something that you'll see, and we'll go through that one later. All right, aircraft performance. Performance of all aircraft is affected significantly by the atmospheric conditions in which they operate. These conditions are constantly varying, based simply on the daily heating and cooling of the Earth by the sun, and the associated winds and precipitation that occur. What does that mean? That means weather. The reason the airplane performs different day to day is weather. It really has nothing to do with the airplane. Might have to do with how much you put in it and stuff, weight, how much fuel you put in it, how big your friend is. So what might affect aircraft performance? Give me some ideas. Weight?
Air density, altitude.
Density, altitude?
Power.
Fuel.
Yeah, the fuel load, how much it weighs.
Wind.
Power.
Power, horsepower, the engine. Yeah.
Wind maybe.
Outside air temperature, humidity, elevation or altitude, weight of the airplane, the CG, how it's loaded, wind, engine performance, and air density. But the three main things are the top ones there. Air temperature, humidity, and I guess it should be density, altitude.
What does CG mean? Aircraft CG?
Center of gravity.
Oh, okay.
So you didn't get that one, but that's how you load the airplane.
Yeah.
You can change the CG range of the airplane.
Okay.
At some point here, this would balance on my finger. You know, say balance right there. Just put more weight in the back, you go that way. Or if you put maybe more fuel in the fuel tanks, because that's forward. And did you get the email that had the links to these?
I didn't have it.
Okay, I thought I put you on it, but maybe you didn't get it. You can go back and read through the old slideshows there.
Yeah, I didn't get it.
And then it's also on. I try to video it and put it on YouTube so you can watch the video and follow along with the slideshow. Then if you don't see that and want it, let me know and make sure you get that information. All right. Well, this is a fun one.
Whoops. It's time. Yeah, she made it. Wow. I got some of us know the story.
Yeah.
Nerves of steel, huh?
So anybody have an idea what happened there?
No.
Way out there.
That's density altitude. So it was hot, and it's clearly kind of maybe an alpine altitude airport. You know, they're probably up at 6,000 or 7,000 feet. It's probably 95, 100 degree day. The atmosphere gets real thin, and it's effectively 12,000 feet up there. The service sea on that airplane is probably 10,000 feet or something. I mean, that airplane barely at the edge of being able to fly, and it's probably was loaded up, a bunch of gas and people. And it's funny that kind of airplane. We'll see another video of that same type of airplane.
Density altitude. What causes it? And how does it affect your airplane? Let's jump right in. Heat, humidity, and altitude all lower the air density, and therefore increase density altitude. Heat causes air molecules to have a lot of energy and move farther apart. Water molecules, as in humidity, displace air molecules, and the lower atmospheric pressure found at altitude causes air molecules to spread farther apart. All of this has a major impact on how your aircraft performs as the wings, engine, and propeller struggle to grip the thinner air. Dealing with high density altitude is commonplace for pilots who often fly in hot weather, high humidity, or higher elevations. But for many of us, it can be easily overlooked with profound implications. So pay attention to density altitude, whether reported during flight planning via the ATIS or by ATC, and use your POH and an E6B to calculate density altitude and aircraft performance. Now, what can you do about it? Here are a few tips. Fly light to avoid max gross weight and high density altitude ramifications when dealing with an airplane already performing differently than you're used to. Determine proper fuel-air mixture. If your checklist suggests full rich mixture at sea level, don't assume the same setting at higher density altitudes. Engines differ, so refer to your airplane's POH or the engine's digital monitor or fuel flow gauge manual for optimum power. For a quick and easy method, advance the throttle to take off power during ground run-up and begin reducing or leaning the mixture until the RPM increases and peaks. That's your optimum setting. If you lean beyond this point, the RPM begins to decrease, and eventually the engine will sputter as it is starved for fuel. Similarly, before joining the traffic pattern, determine the best mixture for optimum power during landing or go-around by applying full power, then leaning until RPM peaks. Fly indicated airspeeds. If rotation speed is 55 knots, don't try to rotate at 40 just because you're eating up more runway than usual. Likewise on landing, the ground and near objects will pass by more quickly. That's correct. Your ground speed is faster for the equivalent airspeed at higher density altitudes when the airplane needs more space to get the required air molecules to fly. Use long runways, but remember the abort point rule. Reach at least 70% of your rotation speed at the runway's midpoint, or abort. For example, a Cessna 172 with a rotation speed of 55 knots departs at 3,000 foot runway. If the airplane's not at 38 knots by 1,500 feet, abort. Watch airspeed and trends and maneuver carefully on climb out and during cruise, as your airplane isn't going to accelerate rapidly, nor climb effectively. On takeoff, get airborne, and then lower the pitch angle to accelerate in ground effect for the remaining available runway. As you approach the runway end, begin a gradual climb and pitch to climb speed. Chair fly this a few times so you're comfortable with the procedure. Be aware that pitch or bank changes will result in a quicker deceleration than at sea level, as airspeed bleeds off faster at higher density altitudes. Aircraft response to flap retraction, especially early flap retraction, will be more exaggerated than at lower density altitudes. Since the engine is less powerful, you can't regain speed and lift quickly, so monitor POH speeds and positive climb indications carefully. For the same reasons, be extremely attentive to flying into canyons and close to mountains or obstacles, and do not rely on visual cues you normally depend on to clear terrain, because your climb path at higher density altitude is much shallower than expected. Fly early in the day when temperatures are cooler, so performance will be better. We're all well aware that aviation is terribly unforgiving of carelessness or neglect, so let's pay attention to density altitude and its effect on airframe, engine, and propeller performance. Think through your density altitude procedures, and never just hope you'll be fine.
So many of you guys actually do flight training, so that might be a little tough to understand. But I talked about the application of it actually in the airplane. We've got another video later on that talks a little bit more about density altitude and how it affects the airplane.
Tell these guys about the mixture now,
So he's talking about the mixture knob there is that, we talked about that, I think the second or third week is airplane systems, and the carburetor or the fuel injector meters the air and the fuel. When the air is thinner, the engine is still putting the same amount of fuel into the engine at the same altitude you were at the airport or sea level. So now that fuel air mixture is rich on the fuel side, and it's not an optimum fuel air mixture for running the airplane. So as we climb in altitude, we need to manually adjust the mixture to compensate the amount of fuel and air that's going into the engine. So that's what they're talking about. High and hot, the air is a lot thinner, so you need to put less gas in to achieve proper RPM. And as you start flying, you'll get the hang of that. It's not really a science from the pilot's perspective. You kind of just set it, and pull it back till you look for RPM to rise, and then if you keep pulling, it'll start running rough, and you push it back in a little bit to where that high RPM was, and that's kind of how you set it. So you do it a couple times, and you'll figure it out. All right, climbing cruise charts. Climbing cruise chart information is based on actual flight tests conducted to a particular airframe. This information is real useful when planning a cross-country flight. You can predict the performance and fuel consumption of the airplane. Manufacturers provide several different charts for climb and cruise performance. Include things from fuel, time, distance, best power setting during cruise and cruise range. So we'll go through a couple of these. Every airplane is different depending on the airplane you're flying. The charts could look different, but the theory on managing these charts is pretty similar. So the first chart is to check for climb performance is the fuel, time, and distance climb chart. This chart gives the fuel amount used during the climb, the time it takes to accomplish the climb, and the ground distance that is covered during the climb. To use this chart, we're going to get the information for the departing airport and for the cruise altitude. And we'll use this figure here. We're going to calculate the fuel, time, and distance to climb based on the information that we get. So here is where is the information? It's not here. I messed that up. There it is, right there. All right. Departing airport pressure altitude is 6,000 feet. Departing airport OAT is outside air temperature. It's 25 Celsius. Our cruise pressure altitude is 10,000 feet. And our cruising outside air temperature is 10 degrees Celsius. So write those notes down. All right. So find the outside air temperature for the departing airport along the bottom left side of the graph. What is that value? Excuse me, what is it? Everybody got these written down? Write these down. Pressure altitude, 6,000 feet. Airport temperature, 25 Celsius. Pressure altitude, 10,000. Cruise air temperature, 10 Celsius. Try to remember this. All right. So we're looking for outside air temperature. You need it still?
Yeah. Can I chime in just a little? Your particular airplane may look a little different in the pilot operating handbook. So this is sort of generic, but they all look real similar to this. So there's sort of a guide. There's an example. Each of these lines are the example. So
And this particular chart is in that FAA handbook. I don't see anybody has that here, but this is a generic chart, an example. This doesn't apply to a particular airplane. And they're all maybe visually a little bit different, but it's the theory on how to interpret the chart that we're going on here. So, all right, everybody got their values written down? So I'm going to go back. I won't have them in front of me. So, find the outside air temperature for the departing airport. That was 25 Celsius? All right. Let's see. So, 25 Celsius right there. Okay, follow a line from 25 Celsius straight up until it intersects the line corresponding to the pressure altitude. So we reach a pressure altitude here. So we're going to go up till we find our pressure altitude. That was 6,000 feet.
Right.
So that's this yellow line here we're looking at. Going right to there. All right. Now, continue from this line straight across until it intersects the other three lines for fuel, time, and distance. You go across here. Boom, here it intersected the fuel line. So we can go straight down. And that value is about 4. So write down that value. 4 gallons. We keep continuing that line. We hit the time line there. That comes down. That looks like that's about, there's 5, so that's probably 6. 6 minutes. And if we keep continuing over with that yellow line, when we get to the distance line, that looks like that's at about a little more than 8. So draw a line straight down from the intersection of altitude. Altitude, fuel, altitude, altitude. Where did I miss that? How did I miss this up?
You're just talking about the 6,000, right?
Yep. Here. We did our 25 degrees, we went up there to our 6,000 pressure altitude. Continue over, and so that's giving us a fuel value, that's giving us our time value, and a distance value, right?
Mm-hmm.
I only did this a few hours ago. How can I remember?
Well, what's the objective here? What is the name of this chart?
Time and distance to climb chart. It's harder when I'm looking up at it.
What's the time for? Is that time to a certain altitude?
Yes. Well, how am I doing here? I'm messing this all up.
Well, it's 8 miles.
Well, this is a lesser important of the nature charts, because then this is. Yeah, but all these graphs look like this. What they do is, they'll give you an example line. So, and they almost always will start right here with a label, a little box to tell you how to do what you're trying to do. So it's giving you generic numbers that you have to alter. In your flight plan, when you decide, actually you had to back up a little bit to know how much we're gonna weigh. You know, you weighted the airplane and the 2 people and you figured that out and you figure out how much gas. But part of the things we do want to find out is how much gas do we need. So there's an order of planning.
What's the unit of distance measurement there?
It took a number of weeks before I finally forgot to put a bunch of slides in there. I guess that's good. How did I mess this up? Well, okay, so we've got our fuel gallons, our time, and our distance, right?
Right.
Figure that out. Okay. Next, we're gonna do it again for our cruise altitude. So we decided to go up to, we're at 10,000 feet for our cruise. Same kind of thing, right? So our cruise temperature is 10.
Mm-hmm.
Look at our cruise altitude here. So here, look at this just here as one chart. You've got one value on this side, and you've got one value here. And you're gonna put your spot on that chart, right? So we've got our temperature value here, we've got our altitude value here. So that's our spot. Now there's another chart here, and so that's why you carry this line over. Now we're using this as a separate chart. So you come over until you intercept these lines now, and these are giving you these values down here. So we come over again, we intercept our fuel lines, we can bring that line down and 0, 10, so that's 5, so that's probably 6 for fuel. And we keep going over until it intercepts the time arc there. And it's a little bit more than 10, but maybe not quite 11. So maybe 10.5. And continue following that line over till it's your distance in miles. And that's right there at 15. Take with these sets of numbers, fuel, time, distance, and subtract them from one another. So we had 6 gallons of fuel on our line. Right? Fuel 6 there. And we had 3.5 on our departure. Damn, I did this morning, Dad. What am I doing wrong? I did this all wrong. You know what? I did it wrong. Bad teacher. I'm not the teacher about it wrong.
On August 4th, 2012, this video made it to the internet. What you're about to witness is a plane crash, as it was experienced from the right seat inside the cockpit. The accident took place on Saturday, June 30th, 2012. At the time of this report, information was preliminary and subject to change, but some had been collected by the NTSB. The aircraft is a Stinson Model 108-3, generally a 165 horsepower single-engine high-wing propeller-driven aircraft capable of carrying 4, plus full fuel and light baggage. An aircraft's performance is dependent, among other things, on the density of the air it moves through. And the aircraft appears to be operating from Bruce Meadows Airstrip, a 5,000-foot-long dirt and grass airstrip situated at an elevation of 6,370 feet, surrounded by 8,000 and 9,000-foot mountain peaks near the town of Stanley, Idaho. And that may be important. Watch what happens here. What you just saw was the aircraft skipping off the ground after having previously become airborne, only after prolonged ground ride. The aircraft seems unwilling to climb. We'll not speculate as to the cause of the crash, but it may nonetheless provide a good example of what pilots call a high-density altitude takeoff. Cold, low-altitude air is more dense. It's thicker than air found at higher altitudes and or higher temperatures. Moisture in the air, humidity, displaces air molecules and also acts to thin the air. For the pilot of a propeller-driven aircraft, thick air has its benefits. It gives the surfaces of the aircraft, the wings and propeller, more to push against, as it were. It gives a naturally aspirated, non-turbocharged engine more air molecules to mix with fuel, and that results in higher power output. Relevant to what you're seeing here, the NTSB has collected air data, including barometric pressure, temperature, and moisture for the accident's location on the day of the crash. Figures show that while the aircraft was physically located at an elevation of 6,370 feet, the air around it was as thin as that found at 9,167 feet on a standard day. In other words, compared with a cooler day at a lower altitude, the engine of this aircraft had less air to mix with fuel, it put out less power, while the propeller moved less air and produced less thrust. Meanwhile, the wings produced less lift for any given speed over the ground. In practice, that means the aircraft needed more land to get to speed and more speed to create lift, all the while working with less available power. It means it was harder for the aircraft to start to fly. Assuming that the pilot was attempting to climb, this particular aircraft appears strained at best and unwilling at worst. Whatever the cause, this was the result. All 4 men involved in this accident walked away. Early reports state that the pilot suffered the worst injury, including a broken jaw. Shown in slow motion, you can get a sense of how the airframe absorbed energy. Each impact with a tree lessens the amount of energy left for the final impact with the ground. The occupants were lucky. Once over the trees, there was very little the pilot could do. Faced with low airspeed and rising terrain, a turn was out of the question. At that point, riding it in might have been their best and only option.
I had so many opportunities to get that
I'm
thing.
Glenn Pugh for avlet.com. Thanks for watching.
Fun, huh?
I don't want to
So
fly.
did that make, that video I think made a lot of sense. You talked about how wings make less lift. I mean, everything was lesser. And we had 4 guys in that airplane. That's pretty stupid.
He was just waiting for a miracle there, you know, obviously
Well,
wasn't flying.
and what he said at the end was, you know, you've been flying over these trees and decided we're not climbing, we turn around and go back to the airport. What happens in a turn?
Lose.
You lose lift, right?
We couldn't do it.
So in a turn, the airplane would have stalled and spun in.
Jeez.
So
He was
crashing
flying-
straight ahead is probably actually the same.
Was flying so low to that nice field for so long.
I know there's a lot of beautiful field to
Oh.
make a decision. He had about 3 minutes where he could have said, I don't like how the airplane's flying.
Shouldn't he have aborted the mission though when he felt that he couldn't lift that thing up anyway?
Well, that's what these charts are for. He should have referenced his charts. He should have weighed everybody that got on that airplane, how much they weigh. He should have figured this stuff out.
Yeah.
In reality, we don't really do that every time. But you should know that 4 people in that airplane with gas
At
and
altitude
9,000
like that?
feet,
Yeah, hot
yeah,
bag.
that airplane's not going to climb.
Same airplane as the last video, huh?
And it's in the last video.
Yeah.
And I had an engine quit on me one of those, so I don't like those very much.
There was a term he used called pressure altitude, that when you go into the graphs, it's always about pressure altitude. And so pressure altitude is a definition that we need to know. And we hit on before a couple of terms. Your opening screen, you missed your opening screen, what our standard is terms?
That was weeks ago.
No, you have it there. Okay. Remember, what is standard temperature? Anybody remember? And the reason for standard temperature is 59 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's because it's not too late.
Oh, no, that's what I thought. Does it go into that? All right. You must stand up.
Well, no, you're right.
Put some grass bring it up.
All right. This is a fuel time and distance to climb table. Here's how we're going to do this. Harding Airport pressure altitude is sea level, so we're just going to use 0 for that value. Harding Airport outside air temperature is 22 Celsius. Our pressure altitude at cruise, we're going to 8,000 feet. And our takeoff weight is 3,400 pounds. So, first column of the chart, we're going to find our weight. Here we are, 3,400 pounds. Move across to pressure altitude. Pressure altitude here. And then you can find, let's see, so different at this angle. All right, here would be sea level altitude, or sea level altitude here, remember, because we're at sea level. Here's our numbers that correspond with our cruising altitude. And that's a 735 foot per minute rate of climb. It would take 10 minutes to get there. It would take 21 pounds of fuel. And it would take 20 miles to get there. Now, we don't usually use fuel in pounds, we usually use fuel in gallons, so we'll have to change that later. Get a gallon value.
6.
Okay, so we got our, I'm bad at teaching this, so I'm gonna read through it. So we got our sea level values here. You see all these values are 0. So if you're, let's say, taking off from an airport that's 4,000 feet, you use these values, or whatever values were in your column that you determined from this value here. So in this case, we're taking off Sea Level Airport, they're 0, so we don't have to do any arithmetic on that. It is known that 21 pounds of fuel are used. and 20 nautical miles is covered. The temperature is 22 Celsius, we know that up there. And that's 7 degrees above standard temperature. Standard temperature is 15. The notes section up here, you always got to read the notes section of all these charts. It says that all these values must be increased by 10% for each 7 degrees above standard. So since we are 7 degrees over standard, we have to multiply those values by 10%. So let's see how what's this formula here. 10 for 10 minutes times 10%. 10% of 10 is 1, so that makes 11 minutes. So that value would be 11 minutes. 10% of fuel. 10% would be 2.1 pounds. So 2.1 plus 21, 23.1, and 10% over 20 would be 2, so add 2 to 20, 22 nautical miles. And then fuel is reported in pounds, not gallons. So since fuel weighs 6 pounds per gallon, so we came up with 23.1 pounds of fuel. It turns to 3.85 gallons of fuel. So that's how you get values for your climb to that altitude. You know how long it's going to take, your climb, the time in minutes, fuel, distance. Let's say you were going at you were 35 or 3,600 pounds. You could maybe split these differences, you know, and come up with kind of an average between them. In the top corner of that chart there, it talks about conditions. Flaps up, gear up. This is clearly a retractable gear airplane, so the gear was up. So if you were flying with the gear down for whatever reason, these values wouldn't apply in this chart. The notes section is important. Add 16 pounds of fuel for engine start, taxi, and takeoff. So if you're planning your trip, you need to know how much fuel you're going to use in that start and taxi. So if we figured a decline here, you would start, but it's telling you right there. And also that note number 2 is important. If you didn't increase any of those values by 10%, you end up coming in a little short. And it's based on 0 wind. So if there was wind, your time is going to be more, your fuel could be more. Your time could be less if it was tailwind.
Hey everyone, Jason Schaffer here of M0A.com, and today I want to talk with you about some performance factors. First off, density altitude. Density altitude is pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature, says the FAA. But what does that mean to you? To put it into plain English, I always explain density altitude as density altitude is where the airplane feels like it's at. Meaning that if density altitude is 2,000 feet at the surface, my aircraft rolling down the runway is going to perform as though it's already at 2,000 feet. This is, of course, for non-aspirated aircraft engines, those that breathe without the assistance of a turbocharger. So you don't have a turbocharger, you're not a turbine aircraft, this applies to you. It's where the airplane feels like it's at. How does your aircraft do performance-wise at higher altitudes? Well, it doesn't perform better, does it? You may burn less fuel and those types of items, but as far as flying out performance, we get a decrease in performance as we increase in altitude. Density altitude is where the airplane feels like it's at. High density altitude means poor performance. Now there's 3 factors that really go into and affect density altitude. The first is high temperatures. The warmer the air, the less dense it will be. Now, don't be confused there. The air is less dense, but that adds to an increase in density, altitude. Follow me with that? These three all here. High temps, high humidity, more water vapor equals less air mass. Those water molecules, that water vapor just attach itself to the oxygen molecules essentially. And thus, we have high humidity. More water vapor equals less air mass. And then lastly, high elevation. The higher the altitude, the less dense the air. We're just adding altitude to density altitude, right? The three factors, high temps, high humidity, high elevation, all add to an increase in density altitude. That will be straight on a check ride. It'll be straight from the knowledge test. Understand that. Now there's three ways I'm going to show you here how to calculate density altitude. The first is how you probably did it on your knowledge test if you've taken one already. Let's look at this chart here. And this chart is straight from the Private Pilot Knowledge Test Supplement. Let's say they give you the temperature as 25 degrees Celsius. Then they give you the altimeter setting of 2980. First things first, as with any performance chart, we need to know our pressure altitude. So we'll take our altimeter setting of 2980, come over to our chart, find 2980, and we get 112 feet as our pressure altitude. Let's make it real easy. Let's say we're right at sea level as our elevation, because if not, you add your field elevation here. So 2980, 112 feet of pressure altitude. Then we get the temperature here is 25 degrees Celsius. So I come on over down here. Remember, we have Celsius here. I have Fahrenheit here. Don't get confused. We come across. I'm looking for 25. So here's 21. Here's 27. Here's halfway in between. So we're leaning slightly this way. I'm coming up. And I told you, like I said, we're just going to sea level essentially. We'll come up. We'll follow this all the way until we hit sea level. And then we'll continue on across. And where does that put us? Again, it's tough to get real accurate. I don't know, roughly 1,300 feet or so, 1,200, 1,300, 1,400 feet, somewhere in that ballpark here is where that actually places us. Now, the other way we can calculate this is using the formula. And this is how I really do it in the real world. Let me break it down here for you. Density altitude equals our pressure altitude plus this formula. 120 multiplied by the difference between our outside air temperature, OAT, subtracted from standard temperature, 15 degrees Celsius. So let's do the math here. We learned on the previous slide our pressure altitude was 112, plus the answer to our formula here. Our outside air temperature was 25, right? Our standard temperature is 15. That there puts us at 10. 120 multiplied by 10 gives us 1,200. I complete the addition to get my density altitude of 1,312 in this case. Not bad, considering we came from the other chart and said, well, it could be 1,200, 1,300, 1,400. We got close, right? Now we can get more exact. Let me show it to you another way and go to our giant E6B here. And again, you thought the way we did it for the knowledge test wasn't exact. Wait till you see this. So maybe you haven't seen this on the E6B, but we have density altitude, which will be shown here in this window, followed by our air temperature here. And talk about, geez, look how big this scale is. We go from 0 to plus 50, and this is degrees Celsius, in this little window here. And then pressure altitude is shown in thousands of feet. So this little inch right here shows 5,000 feet of pressure altitude. So what we're to do here is to take our air temperature, in this case a positive 25 degrees, so there's 20, there's 25, and place it over our pressure altitude in thousands of feet, which is just barely on the other side of 0 here. So we'll come and we go, look, 20, there's 25, I come down here, just barely to the other side of 0, and I look, and I read my density altitude here, also in thousands of feet. I'm just barely on the other side of 1,000, Could it be 1,200? Could it be 13? Could it be 14? You just gotta hold it just right in that spot. Well, we look at our formula and get 1,312. Is it so important to be perfect? Well, for the sake of the knowledge test, yes. But in the real world, would this suffice? Would the chart suffice? Is there really going to be a huge difference on your go or no-go decision? You say, man, if it was just 1,300 feet, I wouldn't go. But because it's 1,200, I'm going anyways. We don't make our go or no-go decisions based on that. We look at it and go, wow, that density altitude's high. I probably shouldn't go flying. I should leave a person behind, leave some bags behind, and make those sort of adjustments. That's what's so important. Understanding the performance characteristics of your aircraft, knowing the 3 factors that increase density altitude, knowing what you can do about it, and knowing how to calculate it. This is more than just the knowledge test. Hopefully you saw a method that speaks to you and you go, okay, this is how I can do that in the real world. I'm excited to read your comments below on Facebook, YouTube, m0a.com, however you're watching this, and just thank you so much. It was so wonderful to meet you all at Sun and Fun and all these air shows just coming up ahead of us. We're so blessed, so excited to meet you, shake your hand, and really hear your aviation story. So enjoy the rest of your day, and most importantly, remember, a good pilot is always learning. Have a great day, guys. See you. Pass your check ride, or I'll pay for it. Join our #1 rated online ground school and participate in live mock check rides and interactive written test prep. Visit groundschoolacademy.com to learn more.
Wait.
Clear as mud? This is a cruise and range performance chart. This is designed to give you true airspeed, fuel consumption, and endurance in hours, and range in miles, given your specific configuration. So, here's our configuration. Our altitude is 5,000 feet. We're running at 2,400 RPM, and we are carrying 38 gallons of gas. 5,000 feet right here. Find the correct RPM for 2,400. There you go, 2,400. Following straight across and read the true airspeed on 116 and fuel burn of 6.9 gallons per hour. So if we're equipped with 38 gallons with no reserve, that'll give us an endurance of 5.5 hours, a range of 635 miles. That's the easy one. We should start with that one. Huh? But look at, make sure you always read the conditions and notes. Maximum cruise is normally limited to 75% power. So if you were operating at a different RPM range, you might have a different burn. But again, this is considering gross weight 2,300 pounds, 0 wind, and you're leaning the engine. If you had wind, that would all vary. But you can take these values, and using your E6B, you can add your wind component and start using these values. You can find the updated value for your wind condition. When you go for your practical exam on your check ride, you're going to end up building a flight plan. You'll use charts like this because you're going to need to figure out how many gallons you're going to need for the trip and all that. And then the objective would be, and maybe we'll try to do it in the last week, is we'll actually go through and do a real flight plan and all that stuff. All right, we talked about weather last week. I wanted to do this video and I forgot to do it. This is a microburst. This is up in Colorado Springs at a glider contest.
Open taxi.
Hey, everybody, watch out for the tow planes. Get away from the tow planes.
Oh my gosh. Holy crap.
Holy crap.
Wind just picked up and pushed that airplane. Luckily, there's a guy in it flying.
He's flying that thing right now?
Yeah. But that guy decided it's time to go flying because the wind came raced through like this. Less than 55 knots. I'd blow my RV over.
What's the ratio of miles per mile?
That's a great question. I should know.
1.15.
1.1
It's 15%.
Look how those guys holding that glider.
I was wondering what they were sitting on that wing for.
Couple gliders up there.
That was
With
cool.
the tails up on that thing. He's flying that airplane trying to keep it on the ground. I mean, those airplanes will fly at 55 knots.
Oh, and then he goes downwind.
This is at the Air Force Academy. So those are make the Air Force codes, right?
Where is that? Is it?
Colorado Springs. And that was dragging the wing on the ground. Downwind's a bad way to take off. See, he's barely flying there. But he's getting pushed a ton. Look at that airplane's barely flying. He's trying to turn into the wind.
Yeah, I did too.
Oh. Oh. Oh.
Yeah, pretty wild. Alright, here's a cruise power setting chart. This is useful when planning your cross-country flight. This gives the correct cruise power setting as well as fuel flow and airspeed performance numbers at a given altitude and airspeed. So our pressure altitude at cruise is 6,000 feet, and our outside air temperature is 36 degrees Fahrenheit above standard. So that doesn't mean that it's 36 degrees, it's 36 degrees above standard. What is standard temperature? 36 degrees above standard, right?
What is like the standard temperature? Why is it 59 degrees?
Why is it 59?
I'm not 60.
It's actually 59.92.
I'm not 60.
I don't know why is that?
I think that's just the average temperature of the planet. It's like dirt is 59 degrees, you know, in a cave. And so that's just the start point. It was agreed upon, that's it, so it's 15 Celsius, 59 Fahrenheit. And standard is also sea level. So you'll see a lot of these references to these charts are standard day sea level. And that's where you start when you climb or go down from there.
So we're gonna go ahead here, but yeah, standard is 15 Celsius, 59 degrees, or 2992 inches of mercury, which is the little value on your altimeter. All right. So pressure altitude of 6,000 feet. There's 6,000 feet. Follow the line across until we get to the table under the plus 36 Fahrenheit chart here. So from 6,000 feet, we'll come all the way across to this chart here. So at 6,000 feet, RPM will be 2450. That's 65% power. I'm just put it on here. That would probably be well, here it is, right? 65% max power right here, full throttle. 2450 RPM. 21 inches of manifold pressure. That's a gauge on your panel. Fuel flow rate of 11.5 gallons an hour. And airspeed of 161 knots, or 185 miles an hour. Notes, always read the notes. See, we go right into this. We didn't read the stuff I'm talking about. 65% maximum power there is 2450 at 21 inches. Full throttle manifold pressure settings are approximately 21 inches. This little pink shaded area represents operation of full throttle. So here's full throttle in here. It looks like it moves up one on this chart. That's a pretty easy chart right there, right? But if you were not 36 degrees above, if you were at a standard day temperature, well here is minus 36. What if you were maybe split between those two temperatures? Just go between the two here. It's the same altitude here. You kind of just split the difference a little bit. The fuel flow at this temperature hasn't changed any, so that value wouldn't change any. Airspeed would change a little bit. When you get to do that, it's not very specific in the sense that this maybe necessarily applies to you.
But there's a reason we wanna know how much fuel we burn.
Right.
But yeah, this is about knowing how much fuel you're going to use in the cruise.
Yeah.
And we had that other chart that talked about planning your fuel for your takeoff. Now we've got our fuel for our cruise. We've got our time for our cruise. Now again, probably doesn't say on here, but probably no wind. So if you had wind, you have to use the E6 speed to figure that out. So there's a lot into building a flight plane. Here's another cruise chart. This is best power mixture or range graph. Gives best range based on a power setting and altitude. So we're going to find the range at 65% power with and without reserve fuel based on these conditions. So outside air temperature is standard. What is that again?
59.94.
What about in Celsius?
15.
15, perfect. So we're doing Celsius on this chart. Bam, there we go. Standard, we got 15. All right. So, all right. All right. Pressure altitude here. Okay. All right. Pressure altitude, 5,000 feet. 3,000, 4,000, 6,000, there's about 5,000 feet. We go straight across until the intercepts our 65% line. We're doing that because that was our value earlier. Find the range at 65% power. So we're here to there's 75, there's 65. And we come straight on down, that gives us our value there. It's almost right between 500 and 550. It's probably 525 or so. At 65% power with the reserve, the range is approximately 500, 522, 525, that's about right. These notes up here, 45 minutes reserve at 55% power, best economy mixture. Here's our, this is our reserve over here. Right, so we're looking for a range with reserve and without reserve. So with a 45-minute reserve, we went to 65, we came to 575. Without a reserve, we came over to our 65% line, let's go down, and that's about 575. So without reserve fuel, we go about 50 miles further. Also, range may be reduced by 7% if wheel fairings are not installed. Well, this airplane has wheel fairings installed.
That's good.
So we don't have to make a change for this. It's saying if you don't have it, we have to reduce it. This note here, add 0.6 nautical mile for each degree Celsius above standard temperature, and subtract 1 nautical mile for each degree Celsius below standard temperature. Well, we're at standard, so we don't need to worry about that.
What's no wings mean?
What's up?
It says wings, no?
Yeah, that.
What does it say?
Says wings, no.
No wings.
The helicopter chart.
Oh.
Again, this doesn't apply to a particular airplane. This is FAA made this as an example. So they might you have a bunch of other questions that would reference this chart. And yeah, they might use it as a helicopter thing. Or something. Good question, though.
Wing fuel?
Good question because you read it.
Okay.
You know, it's easy to not read all this stuff and miss stuff. So this is really the two charts, right? Well, here's one chart, and here's another chart.
What are fairings?
Is that
Fairings.
Wheel firm.
a wheel cover, like a streamlined teardrop-looking cover that would go over a wheel?
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, you know, so this is just. They're not here. I moved
Yeah,
that.
yeah, I know
Yeah,
what.
so, that's just a
I've seen one.
not
before.
installed, but someone having.
Right.
It reduces drag. Yeah, a little faster.
I saw them at the air show the other day.
Yeah. All right. Last cruise chart referenced is a cruise performance graph. It's designed to tell true airspeed performance of the airplane depending on altitude, temperature, and power setting. So, our outside air temperature is 16, pressure altitude 6,000 feet. Find 16, go up till intercept 6,000 feet. Now you bring it over into this chart. So now we're done with this chart. Going over here, and you're looking for power setting 65%. Boom, put that there. Wheel fairings not installed. That's probably a note about that later. So now that gives us 140 true airspeed in knots. Subtract 8 knots if wheel fairing is not installed. Wheel fairing is not installed, so 8 from 140, 132. Now we went to this solid line here. You see that's best power. But you might have gone to this line here for best economy. You want the economy cruise. In which case you come down from there. There's probably about 142 or no 132. Like that. If you subtracted your 8 from there, 124 from there. Yeah, it says fairly installed, but that was what they gave us, so yeah. There's another chart right here on these two lines. These for two different propellers here, a 2-blade prop or a 3-blade prop. So if you vary from your temperature, time your temperature, switch your altitude, you carry it all the way over, you come in here. Here would be your airspeed if you had this 2-blade prop. Here might be your airspeed if you had this 3-blade prop. 3-blade's a little faster, but not by much. And I've never actually seen this before, but, you know, this is just more information that they put on this same chart, you know, rather than making a separate chart for it. But if you go through the airplane flight manual, there'll be a lot of different charts in it. And they're not all too tough, you know, I mean, the chart has a value here and a value here, and you've got to find the value in the middle. But you're real good at this doing math. All right, here's just a chart. This is giving any values. Somebody already put these red lines on it. Let's try to figure this out. I haven't even looked at it yet. So outside air temperature in Fahrenheit here. Looks like 40, 60, 80. So that'd be 70. So maybe it's 75 to 80 in there. And so here is your temperature. Come up. Find your pressure altitude. So they stopped right about here. There's 2,000 feet and there's sea level, so they probably stopped at 1,000 feet pressure altitude there. So then we bring this over. Here's the reference line for this next chart. We're starting here. And then we're following these angular lines now to our gross weight. So that's 2,200 pounds. Follow that down here to 2,200 pounds. I should read what the chart is. Landing performance. Just looking for your landing distance. There's 40 degrees of flaps in this PA-28 airplane. 2,200 pounds is what we're loaded at. We bring it over here to, now this section chart is wind. And we're going to add in our wind. So wind is 5 knots. So we see the little dashed lines right there. I want you to kind of follow that. Right, so we're intersecting here, so we're going to kind of follow those. Or this red line looks like it doesn't quite line up. It goes up to 5 knots there, which would mean 1,500 feet is our landing distance over a 50-foot obstacle. Did I do that right? What's that? I can't hear you. So this is a real chart. There'll probably be 3 or 4 of these that all say landed, but different flap settings or something. 30 degrees flaps, 10 degrees flaps, no flaps. And that might be one of those trick questions that you get is, here's 4 charts that look almost identical. You gotta make sure you read all the information given to you. You're making a power approach with no flaps. Here's a chart, in this chart. This would be the wrong chart. So you gotta make sure you read all the details. All right, another one I gotta. And I like looked at this once beforehand, so. All right. Our example, Archer Airport pressure altitude is 2,000 feet. So we find that on here. Here's the 2,000 foot line right there. And our temperature is 21 Celsius, so this is in Celsius, so there's 21. So we go up till we intercept our 2,000 foot pressure altitude right there. Now we're going to bring that value over. Here's the reference line for the next chart. So now we're into the next chart. All right. Our weight, 2,400 pounds. There's 2,400 pounds. It's got these downward swooping lines because you're supposed to follow those. So, you know, if your value is right here and wants you to kind of split that difference. See how they get narrower there? You draw your line, kind of stay in the middle there. So this one is right on the line. That's nice and easy. So we come down here to 2,400 pounds. Good. Then we're going to move on over. Reference line here is for our next chart right here. And we're looking for 15 knot headwind. Let's call, there's our 15 knot wind. And again, we follow these little lines here. We grind it down. 1,500, 2,000. Our takeoff distance over a 50-foot barrier is probably about 18 or 1,900 feet. 1,900 feet.
What's the 50-foot barrier you're talking about?
That's kind of a standard value in these charts. Is assuming at the end of the runway there's trees or buildings or something. We're not really gonna know if that tree is 50 feet or not, but
50 feet high.
there's either no obstacle at the end of the runway or there's a 50-foot obstacle. If there's a taller obstacle, well, you want to go shorter, but that's just standard how you see these broken out. I think in the airports are supposed to manage the obstacles or whatever. And there's not going to be a runway that goes right into a mountain.
Plus you wanna be 50 feet, when you go off the end, you don't wanna be 1 foot off the ground.
You wanna be 50 feet high.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the end of this runway, you might go, it looks about 50 feet. That's 150 foot tall
Yeah.
mountain. The second you're an underperforming airplane, that turns into a big old obstruction.
Be more than trees.
Here is a range chart. I want to quiz somebody with this, so let's make up a scenario here. At 65% power and at 5,000 feet, what would our range be? 5,000 feet, here's 4,000, 6,000, so 5,000 is probably right about here. And here is our 65% power, so we come on over right there. Here's about 98 knots, there you're about 101. Right. 99 knots, maybe? What about 8,000 feet and 55% power? What would our speed be? 25. 8,000 feet, 55% power. You're right there. See? Easy. All right. I'm on board of that. Physiology. This is not something I'm very good at, but important stuff to know. And there are a lot of questions relating to this. Navigation demands upon compensatory mechanisms of the body are numerous. The environmental changes of the greatest physiological significance in flight are barometric pressure, variation in temperature, and movement at high speeds in 3 dimensions. It's talking about throwing off your internal sensors and stuff, you know. Airplanes nowadays have pressurization and climate control in the cabins can lower fatigue on pilots and passengers. But little old airplanes like this don't have any of that, so you've got to take into consideration all those kinds of stresses that you would consequences of human experience in the airplane. Things like oxygen when you're above 10,000 feet, fatigue from being awake too long or being sick. You ever had that thing where you get water in your ears or something and you feel like you're walking around crooked?
Mm-hmm.
That can happen to you in the airplane. If you feel like you're crooked in the airplane and you can't see outside because you're in the clouds maybe, you're going to turn that airplane so that you feel like you're level. You might be in turn. And that's how people die. So human factors and physiology is stuff that the FAA wants you to be aware of and how it affects you as the pilot. Whole list of things here. Physics of the atmosphere, respiration and circulation, hypoxia, hyperventilation, altitude-induced decompression sickness, pressurization in oxygen equipment, spatial disorientation, stress, noise, vision, physical fitness, and survival. There's a pretty good FAA publication on this. It's like 70 pages, but it's not all words, a lot of charts and pictures and stuff. That's probably a good self-study thing, but I don't know if I'm right at such stuff. But that's why I found it fantastic.
Humans normally dwell at the bottom of the atmosphere, where sea level air pressure is about 14.7 pounds per square inch, or about 30 inches of mercury as measured by a barometer. The air we breathe is roughly 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and 1% other gases. As we breathe, air is brought into the lungs, and the oxygen we need is forced through the thin-walled sacs of the alveoli, where it then passes into the bloodstream. The pressure of the atmosphere is what pushes the air through the walls of the alveoli. The blood transports the oxygen to the cells where it is burned to fuel our body, and the byproduct, carbon dioxide, is then carried back to the lungs and is exhaled. The buildup of CO2 in the lungs is what triggers the breathing reflex. Nitrogen is also carried throughout the body by the bloodstream, some of it going into suspension in the cells. Nitrogen is an inert gas, and under normal pressures has no effect on the body. Hypoxia is a condition in which the body, or part of the body, is deprived of adequate oxygen. Perhaps the most common type of hypoxia experienced by pilots is hypoxic hypoxia, where there is not enough oxygen available to the brain. Just like a mountain climber, a pilot will encounter reduced air pressure as they climb to the higher altitudes. Although the ratio of oxygen is the same, the pressure of the atmosphere is reduced, resulting in less air being pushed into the lungs. Pilots compensate for this in one of two ways, either by pressurizing the air inside the cockpit and cabin of the airplane, or by breathing 100% oxygen through a mask. High-performance aircraft, such as airliners and corporate jets, use their engines to pump compressed air into the cockpit and cabin, keeping the relative pressure high enough to force air into the lungs. Pilots of unpressurized aircraft breathe supplemental oxygen from oxygen tanks. However, breathing 100% oxygen from a mask typically only works up to about 40,000 feet. Most smaller aircraft don't carry oxygen systems or have pressurized cockpits, so pilots of these aircraft need to be aware of the reduced oxygen with an increase in altitude. In fact, the FAA has imposed limits on how high a pilot can go without being on supplemental oxygen. With the decrease in oxygen in your bloodstream, there is a decrease in your vision and mental functioning. That is also why they recommend going on oxygen at 10,000 feet in the daytime, but only 5,000 feet at night, as your eyes need extra oxygen to function at night. Stagnant hypoxia occurs when there is a decrease in blood flow to the cells in your body. Simply put, your body cannot circulate your blood. This is first evident in your vision and then your brain function. Fighter pilots and aerobatic pilots experience stagnant hypoxia when the G-forces created by quick changes of acceleration prevent the blood from flowing normally. This interrupts the supply of oxygen to the eyes and brain, which results in a blackout. Special straining and breathing techniques can be used to reduce the effect of stagnant hypoxia. Hypemic hypoxia occurs when the blood is unable to accept and transport oxygen. For pilots, this may occur if carbon monoxide is entering the cockpit, perhaps from a leaking cabin heater. Smokers also suffer hypemic hypoxia whenever they inhale smoke. The hemoglobin in your blood absorbs carbon monoxide 200 times more rapidly than oxygen. When carbon monoxide binds with your red blood cells, they have no room to carry the oxygen your body needs. Carbon monoxide is a byproduct of all internal combustion engines and combustion heaters and is odorless and colorless. Many aircraft have carbon monoxide detectors to alert flight crews if carbon monoxide enters the cockpit. Histotoxic hypoxia occurs when there is enough oxygen in the blood, but the body's cells are unable to make use of it. This form of hypoxia can occur when the body has been poisoned by drugs or alcohol. It should be noted that drinking just 1 ounce of alcohol has the same effect as climbing 2,000 feet in terms of oxygen impairment. The lack of oxygen creates visual and mental impairment. Symptoms are lightheadedness, a feeling of euphoria, dizziness, blue fingernails and lips, also known as cyanosis, tingling in the extremities, and headache. The symptoms experienced differ by person, and each may not be experienced by everyone. Prolonged hypoxia will result in unconsciousness, and at high altitudes, it may result in an untimely death. If you notice any of these symptoms, it is important to increase your intake of oxygen. Check your cabin pressurization or oxygen system. If it is malfunctioning, you need to descend to a lower altitude quickly. If you suspect carbon monoxide poisoning, turn off any cabin heaters, open all fresh air sources, and land as soon as possible. When under stress or experiencing anxiety, some people will breathe too rapidly. This way of breathing results in hyperventilation, where too much carbon dioxide is being exhaled and creates a lack of CO2 in the blood. The resulting symptoms of dizziness, weakness, fainting, and tingling sensations of the lips, hands, and feet are very similar to the symptoms of hypoxia. What's more, the symptoms can cause anxiety, which in turn stimulates more hyperventilation and exacerbates the symptoms further. It is important to diagnose hyperventilation correctly and not confuse it with hypoxia and vice versa. The symptoms of hypoxia can also cause a pilot anxiety, which could trigger hyperventilation, aggravating that situation. To a new pilot, some maneuvers such as stalls may be stressful, just as a real emergency would be stressful to an experienced pilot. Treatment for hyperventilation is accomplished by deliberately slowing your breathing down to a normal rate. If necessary, you can breathe into a paper bag, which allows you to rebreathe your exhaled CO2, helping your body regain proper CO2 balance more quickly. It is possible to suffer from both hypoxia and hyperventilation at the same time. If you're not sure which one you have, it's always safer to put on an oxygen mask and take deeper, slower, controlled breaths. Remember how 78% of the air around us is made up of nitrogen? When we breathe, nitrogen gas gets absorbed by the body, some of it going into suspension in our cells, some of it being exhaled. At constant pressure, the nitrogen causes no harm. But if we transition quickly to a lower pressure, not enough nitrogen can leave our body through normal respiration. The excess will then bubble out from the cells and can cause damage around joints and nerves. For general aviation pilots and passengers, the encounter of decompression sickness is often due to scuba diving before a flight. During a dive, a scuba diver is subjected to increased pressures. For each 33 feet of depth, the water pressure increases by 1 atmosphere, or about 17 psi. What this means is that the deeper a diver goes, and the longer he or she stays down, the greater the amount of nitrogen that is absorbed by their body. Divers can go down and stay down long, but need to make decompression stops at designated depths to outgas the surplus nitrogen. Even after making the decompression stops, a diver could still face decompression sickness if they were to continue ascending to higher altitudes, say in an airplane. This is why pilots need to know that they should not take anyone flying that has been scuba diving until that person has been on the surface for at least 12 hours or 24 hours for anyone who has done a dive requiring decompression stops. Symptoms of decompression sickness are joint pain, called the bends, tingling sensations, seizures, and unconsciousness. Treatment is accomplished by quickly descending to a lower altitude and administering 100% oxygen if available. Finally, a trip to a hospital or a diver's recompression chamber would repressurize the individual and remove the gas bubbles from their blood. As we climb and descend, the air pressure around us changes. The internal cavities behind the eardrum and the sinuses also need to equalize. This keeps the internal and external pressures the same. When pressure changes are small and slow, this presents no problem. However, when the pressure change is rapid or the ventilation passages are constricted due to a cold or sinus condition, then equalizing the internal pressure with the outside air can be difficult. Pressure on the outside of your eardrum is balanced by the inner ear air pressure. The inner ear equalizes through eustachian tubes, which travel from your inner ear to the back of your throat. When ascending to a higher altitude, the outside air pressure decreases and the higher internal pressure can easily vent out. However, when descending, the eustachian tubes tend to squeeze closed due to the higher outside pressure and do not allow the ears to easily equalize. Some people have voluntary control of the muscles that flex the eustachian tubes and can equalize the pressure with little difficulty. Others must swallow, yawn, or chew to flex the eustachian tubes. If these methods fail, you can try something called the Valsalva maneuver. Hold your nose closed with your fingers and blow through your nose gently to clear your ears. Do not blow too hard or you could damage your eardrums. These ear clearing methods must be used before discomfort is felt. It is extremely difficult to equalize your ears if a blockage has occurred and the pressure differential has become too great. If you or your passengers experience trouble clearing your ears while descending, stop the descent and climb back up to a higher altitude until the lower pressure relieves the discomfort. You can then descend again, but this time more slowly, clearing your ears continuously to prevent another blockage. Continuing to descend with an ear blockage can result in a ruptured eardrum or burst capillaries inside the inner ear. There is no way to manually control the venting of the sinus cavities. If you have a bad head cold or sinus condition, do not fly. Flying with blocked sinuses can result in severe pain between the eyes and the forehead and may even result in bleeding from the sinus membranes. Our bodies consist of up to 60% water, and we require 2 to 4 quarts of new water each day to keep our systems running properly. Our comfort zone is 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit with 25 to 50% relative humidity. Sun-baked ramps and the greenhouse heating of air trapped inside aircraft cockpits can run temperatures up to well over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Cockpit avionics can push temperatures even higher. High humidity will limit the effectiveness of sweating to help cool our bodies. Studies have shown that as body temperature increases, there is an increase in error rate in motor skills, mental functioning, and short-term memory. Hot conditions also increase irritability, hostility, and frustration, increasing the instances of interpersonal friction, loss of tempers, and miscommunication. Without enough water, our physical and mental abilities decline. The first noticeable effect of dehydration is fatigue, which can be followed by sleepiness, dizziness, headache, cramps, and nausea. Drinking enough fluids is especially important when performing physical exercise and when exposed to hot temperatures. Flying at high altitudes and breathing aviation oxygen are especially dehydrating. The cockpit air at high altitudes ranges from 3 to 5% humidity, and aviation oxygen contains zero moisture to prevent water from freezing up the system at low temperatures. This means a pilot is losing moisture from their lungs and skin at a rate of 2 to 4 ounces per hour. The smart pilot makes sure he or she drinks plenty of water before flying and carries a water bottle on long flights. You often don't feel thirsty until after you approach a 1.5 quart deficit, so drink before you feel thirsty. Also, try to stay away from too much coffee, tea, caffeinated sodas, and alcohol. All of these drinks are diuretics, which cause you to urinate more than usual, to flush the associated impurities from your system, and caffeine and sugar can inhibit the absorption of water. When exposed to high temperatures for long periods, or when performing exercises, it is possible to suffer heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Mild heat stroke causes loss of physical and mental abilities. Severe heat stroke can result in unconsciousness and even death. Heat stroke symptoms consist of feeling hot, often without sweating, dizziness and fainting, muscle weakness and cramps, rapid heartbeat and breathing, nausea and vomiting, confusion, disorientation, seizures, and unconsciousness. When flying during hot weather, be sure to stay properly hydrated and try to find shade and fresh air. This can be difficult in a bubble canopy aircraft, so drink plenty of water. Wear loose-fitting, light-colored clothing and a hat. If possible, use a canopy shade and make use of air vents and other cockpit ventilation and cooling. Stress and fatigue. Stress and fatigue can seriously reduce a pilot's ability to fly safely. Airline pilots are required to have at least 10 hours of rest, which includes 8 hours for sleep before any flight duty. They are also prohibited from flying more than 30 hours per week or more than 8 hours in a day without a rest period. The airlines are also required to conduct fatigue education and awareness training programs for all flight crew and dispatchers. Fatigue can seriously diminish a pilot's ability to perform their tasks, and stress can prevent a pilot from focusing on his or her flying. Symptoms of fatigue include reduced speed and accuracy of performance, lapses of attention, delayed reactions, impaired reasoning, and decision-making. Poor risk evaluation, reduced situational awareness, and low motivation to perform optional activities. It has been said that heavy fatigue is more debilitating to pilot performance than 3 alcoholic drinks. To reduce fatigue and the symptoms of fatigue, get plenty of sleep before the start of your flight. Before and during your flight, drink plenty of water. During long flights, periodically shift your position in your seat. Do isometric exercises, and if the cabin allows, get up and walk around periodically. Although caffeine in coffee and energy drinks has been proven to provide temporary alertness, be aware of the diuretic effects and possible resulting dehydration, and beware of the energy crash following a sugar high. When possible, try and take a nap. Many FBOs have crew rest areas with reclining chairs or bunks just for this purpose. Stress. Some stress is normal, such as when coping with a very demanding task, such as flying an instrument approach in bad weather. Under this short-term stress, the body releases adrenaline, and your heart rate and blood pressure increase. All of this helps you to concentrate on the important task, and when the stressful task is over, your system returns to normal. However, under chronic stress, such as relationship problems, financial difficulties, or school or work problems, the stress does not go away. This long-term type of stress may place a burden on the pilots, which they are unable to cope with. That causes their piloting performance to deteriorate below acceptable limits. Pilots under severe chronic stress should ground themselves and seek professional help. Motion sickness. Motion sickness occurs when your brain feels that there is a disagreement between what is seen and what your body feels. When flying in turbulence or while performing aerobatic maneuvers, your inner ear is supplying your brain with information about movement, changing orientation, and g-forces, while your eyes may be looking at the stationary references of the surrounding cockpit. This conflict between what you feel and what you see can lead to symptoms of motion sickness like nausea, sweating, feeling hot and faint, and finally, vomiting. An individual has little control over these symptoms. In fact, some of the world's best and most famous pilots suffered motion sickness. The good news is that most pilots build a tolerance to motion sickness with experience. There are also some tricks you can use to prevent or reduce the symptoms. Focusing your gaze on the horizon will minimize the disagreement between your eyes and your inner ears. Keep plenty of fresh air flowing into the cockpit, especially against your face. Consider even opening up the windows. When detecting the onset of air sickness symptoms, stop doing what made you sick. For example, if you're doing stalls or spins or aerobatics, stop the maneuvers and fly straight and level. Try to fly when the air is smooth and cool, such as early in the morning, or at altitudes above the bases of the clouds. Concentrate on the task at hand. The pilot flying is usually not the first one to get sick. His mind is busy and doesn't have the time to be confused with secondary information. Remember when you were a kid on the playground and you spun on the merry-go-round, then jumped to the ground and couldn't walk straight? The world was spinning, you were dizzy and fell over. Well, you were experiencing vertigo. What happened was the fluid in your inner ear got to spinning along with the merry-go-round. Then stop your movement, only to have the fluid in your balance sensors keep moving, giving you erroneous information. You can do this to yourself in an airplane too, especially when doing spins or by changing the orientation of your head while turning. When experiencing vertigo, you should look to the natural horizon for correct information. When that is not available, such as on a dark night or while flying in the clouds, you should look to your attitude flight instruments. After the confusing motion stops, normal sensory information will return. Illusions. Illusions occur when what you think you see is different from what you really see. For instance, you could confuse the lights of small boats on the water with the stars, or mistake a slanting cloud deck with the horizon. The solution for most illusions is to constant cross-check between visual and instrument references. Some other common illusions that pilots encounter are mistaking an approach to a skinny runway as being too high, or having runways that have uphill to downhill slopes, generating erroneous glide path impressions. Vision. A pilot's most important sense is vision. Understanding how your eyes work will allow you to compensate for their limitations. Light entering your eye is focused by the lens and then falls upon the retina. The retina is made up of light-sensing cells called rods and cones. Most of the cones are concentrated around the center of your vision and detect color and are responsible for a higher resolution and detailed vision. The rods, on the other hand, are located outside of the center of vision and are better at detecting movement and are very sensitive at low light levels. Each eye has a small blind spot where the optic nerve is attached to the retina. Here, there are no rods or cones. Since the nerve attaches in a slightly different place in the field of vision for each eye, the brain blends the two images together and blind spots are normally not noticeable. The blind spot can become apparent, however, when what you are looking at cannot be seen by both eyes. Empty field myopia. When looking into a hazy background or sky without prominent features, a pilot's eyes tend to relax and focus at a distance of only 10 to 30 feet away. When the eyes are focused so close, it is difficult to detect objects in the distance, such as other airplanes. To prevent this phenomenon, pilots should actively scan by shifting their gaze to different sectors and concentrating on spotting potential distant objects. By actively seeking airplanes in the distance, the eyes will maintain focus at the correct focal length. Since the eye detects motion with its peripheral vision, the search technique that works best is to concentrate momentarily on a sector of about 15 degrees in width. Stare without moving your eyes, then shift to the next sector and hold your focus there momentarily before shifting again. At each sector, look on the horizon, then above, then below, before moving to the next sector. When scanning this way, any moving target will be more obvious to the eye. Having said this, however, it is the target that stays stationary in your field of vision, the one that is not moving in relation to your flight path, that has the greatest collision potential. Night vision. When you turn out the lights at night, you can't see anything at first, but after a few minutes, you can see fairly well in the dark. Why is that? The rods of your eyes are 10,000 times more sensitive to light than your cones and are responsible for your night vision. However, they can be overwhelmed by bright lights and take up to 30 minutes to adapt to low light environments. They also do not detect color, which is why colors are hard to see in the dark. Remember how the center of your field of vision is made up almost exclusively of cones? That means at night you have a blind spot in the middle of your view. If you are trying to pick out a small object at night, such as an airport light beacon or the strobes of a distant aircraft, you will have more success if you look slightly off-center so that the rods can pick up the target. Alcohol and drugs. Flying, at times, can be a very demanding activity. It calls for good hand-eye coordination, and even more importantly, it requires accurate perceptions and good decision-making. Substances that can dull or distort your mental and physical abilities have no place in aviation. Medical studies show that even 1 ounce of alcohol has a measurable negative short-term effect on your ability to reason and to perform complex tasks. Federal aviation regulations prohibit flying within 8 hours of consuming any alcohol. The time before flying should be extended longer if you are still under the influence after 8 hours. Regulations also prohibit flying if you are under the influence of any drugs, legal or illegal. Some over-the-counter drugs, especially those for colds and allergies, can impair your physical and mental performance. Pilots need to read the packaging carefully and consult with their aviation medical examiner before using any medication and flying. It is also important for pilots to know that it is not just the flight crew that must not fly under the influence. It is also illegal for a pilot to take a passenger flying that is drunk or suffering under the influence of drugs. A disrupted passenger can seriously compromise the safety of a flight.
I asked if anybody had questions on that, but I don't know if I can answer them. A lot of stuff, huh? Any questions at all? All right. You kind of touched on it, and we saw it in the video earlier. First question, when must the pilot use supplemental oxygen? That was just a pop-up video, just so you can see that part. Above 12,500 feet for more than 30 minutes. And passengers have to use it continuously above 15,000 feet. And isn't FAA recommended at 11,000 feet?
Wait, it's, say that again, it's,
12.5 over
it's
30 minutes.
anytime over 12.5, right? Or,
No, above 12.5 for more than 30 minutes.
well, then what's 10,000 feet?
But that 10,000 is the recommendation, right? They recommended over 10,000 or something? That is 11,000.
I think they said 10,000.
Yeah.
Okay, wake turbulence. This one's fun.
The wing produces a pressure differential between its top and bottom surfaces as it moves through the air. As a result, the high pressure air from below the wing tries to move toward the low pressure area above the wing. The wing gets in the way and lift is produced. At the wingtips, however, the high pressure air from below the wing spills around to the top of the wing. As a result, a pair of wingtip vortices are produced, which trail behind the airplane as it flies. If a wing is producing lift, it is also producing wingtip vortices. The strength of an airplane's wingtip vortices depends on the amount of lift being produced by the wing. Vortex intensity varies with an airplane's weight, speed, wing design, and configuration. Wingtip vortices will be the strongest when the producing airplane is heavy, slow, and in a clean configuration, such as during takeoff. Wingtip vortices tend to sink at about 400 to 500 feet per minute, slowing their rate of descent over time. They tend to level off about 900 feet below the altitude at which they were produced and then dissipate over time. If they are generated near the ground, they will usually stop descending within 200 feet of the ground and then begin to move apart from each other until they dissipate. In this case, their lateral movement tends to be at a slow speed of only a few knots. An encounter with another airplane's weight can cause your airplane to roll uncontrollably. This lack of control could be very dangerous, especially near the ground, when the pilot has minimum time to recover from such an upset. At any altitude, it would be possible for wake turbulence to damage the airplane if it were encountered. It can't be seen, so pilots have to learn to visualize and avoid wake turbulence. Since the vortices sink and dissipate, wake turbulence avoidance usually comes down to staying above the flight path of the generating airplane. If you are landing behind a larger airplane, staying above the airplane's flight path all the way to landing would mean landing at or beyond its touchdown point. A common mistake is to stay above the other plane's path until the last few hundred feet, and then forget all about the wake turbulence to concentrate on the landing. However, the other airplane produces turbulence all the way to touchdown. Make sure to land beyond the touchdown point, or go around if you're not comfortable with the situation. If you are departing behind a larger aircraft, you should note its rotation point. It will start generating vortices as soon as its nose wheel comes off the ground. Staying above its flight path means taking off prior to its rotation point and climbing so as to remain above its flight path, or turning to diverge from its flight path. Wingtip vortices move with the wind. Since they drift at a few knots over the ground, this means that a few knots of crosswind can hold the upwind vortex in place, or could carry the downwind vortex over to a parallel runway. When landing on a downwind parallel runway, be cautious of wake turbulence from the other runway, which could drift over to your runway with the wind. If landing with a crosswind of a few knots, be cautious of that upwind vortex, which is likely sitting in place right over the runway. Stay above the flight path of the previous arrival and land beyond its touchdown point. A light quartering tailwind is particularly hazardous with regards to wake turbulence, since it brings that upwind vortex down the runway and holds it in place right over the runway. Wake turbulence avoidance must also be visualized in relation to all operations near larger aircraft, not just when arriving or departing behind one. Maybe another airplane departs or lands via a runway, which crosses the runway you'll be landing or departing from. If that airplane's nose wheel is in the air when it crosses your runway, it just showered that runway intersection with wake turbulence, and that wake will drift with the wind. If an airplane executes a low approach, a missed approach, or a touch-and-go landing, then the runway they just flew over will have wake turbulence descending on it, which drifts with the wind for the next several minutes. Visualize where the wake turbulence is, stay above it, avoid it laterally, or wait a few minutes until it dissipates. Wake turbulence can also be encountered en route or in the traffic pattern. Usually 1,000 feet below the other airplane is sufficient to avoid wake turbulence. Remember to be extra alert if the other airplane's vortices might remain in your touchdown area, drift in from a nearby runway, sink into your takeoff or landing path from a crossing runway, sink into the traffic pattern from operations at a nearby airport, or sink into your flight path while en route. Depending on the circumstances, air traffic control may inform you of traffic you are following at a proximity such that wake turbulence will be a factor. Air traffic control will use the phrase, "Caution, wake turbulence," and advise you of the traffic. Air traffic control is not responsible for your wake turbulence avoidance. The controller will expect you to adjust your flight path as necessary to avoid the wake turbulence while conforming with your air traffic control clearance or instructions. If you're unsure about where the turbulence is, or you are uncomfortable, don't hesitate to take the appropriate action, such as performing a go-around and reporting to the tower that you weren't comfortable with the wake turbulence. Oftentimes, taking a delay of only a few minutes will allow that wake turbulence to dissipate. Pilots of light aircraft also need to be cautious of jet wash, prop wash, and rotor wash. Make sure adequate space exists between you and airplanes and helicopters you are taxiing behind or around. For jet airplanes, this distance might be 500 to 1,000 feet. For helicopters, 3 times the rotor diameter is generally considered to be the extent of the rotor wash. When a helicopter is in forward flight, it generates a trail of rotor wash that behaves similarly to the wingtip vortices of an airplane.
This happened just 3 days ago. Southern California. Here's the helicopter. Here's the runway right here. Here comes the Cessna 120, just like the one we got. We've got helicopters here, and if you're going to fly my airplane, do not do that. Just wait a little bit. Yeah, that's kind of a, I mean, that's a realistic thing that could happen. All right, let's see. Yeah, what's that time?
There's a helicopter.
See it? Say again? See it?
Does a helicopter have both vortices on both sides of that prop that's running on
Oh,
on
it's more the wash that comes down.
Oh, it's coming down, okay.
It gets pushed away when it's near the ground, and it does make.
That's what
make
tilted
it-
them up like that, huh?
Yeah.
Good. Unpreserved.
Want to try to pull that landing gear down?
No, 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 no.
Yeah, don't try this at home.
Yeah, don't try this.
Oh,
We definitely don't put it on the internet anymore.
Oh, my God.
Hey, look, you got it though.
Yeah.
Was that a practice run or was that a real live?
That's a real
rescue.
story. All right. We'll do some practice questions here about all kinds of different categories, and we'll try to do this on the last week as well. When you take your private pilot written exam, you've got 150 minutes to answer 60 questions. Normal VFR operations in Class D airspace with an operating control tower require a visibility and ceiling to be at least. Right, so I'm gonna do an answer. Give me a right answer. We talked about the airspace a little bit with the weather last week. What was that
Okay.
I don't want to say yes. All the FAA questions, all they just ask you only get 3 answers, not 4. And they do this kind of thing a lot. Like, here's 1,000, and here's 1,000, here's 3, and here's 3. That's pretty good guess. If you don't know, don't be guessing. But that's pretty common.
So B is the correct, is it?
You should know that. That's really your ass out of the check. We didn't talk about land and hold short stuff. I'm surprised when you got this, but minimum visibility for a pilot to receive a land and hold short clearance. Anybody, any idea about that? New statute. 3 and 3, statute and statute. So let's start. We'll see that question.
Ooh, can we question, when there's this confusion of statute and nautical, is there sort of a rule of thumb which you use when?
In what context?
Well, what I was getting at is, on the ground, around runways, statute tends to be issued. At altitude, that's a little bit general, but generally at altitude is nautical miles. Your specific airplane that you learn to fly in may be nautical or statute, we talked about that before. So that
Yeah,
that doesn't.
the airspeed indicator, like on the 120, is in miles an hour. It's statute miles.
But that doesn't
Later
change the
airplanes
rule.
say airspeed would be in knots. Nautical miles. But yeah, there's different presentations on the charts, and that's why the plotters got statute miles on one side. And, nautical
Wind
miles.
is always in knots. Visibility can be, which knots is nautical miles per hour. So there's kind of, you're just getting used to it, just keep your ears open on them, it's, the visibility.
Yeah, not an easy one to describe when and where, but you use one or the other.
And the conversion's a good question, that Don answered, or asked. A knot, 100 knots is 115 miles per hour, so it's 15%. A nautical mile is 15% bigger than the statute.
Nautical miles, what?
15% bigger.
Okay.
Its number will be smaller because it's bigger.
amount of water vapor this air cannot hold depends on about that? The temperature. Okay, here's a TAF. We kind of only touched on this. Here, when you do get the written test, you'll get a booklet that has figures and examples. And this is one of them here. In this TAF, what does SHRA stand for? Right there. Does anybody know what RA stands for?
Rain,
Rain. What
A,
else is rain? SH?
shower.
Probably shower, right? So, angular difference between true north and magnetic north is, we did this last week.
A,
Deviation is your compass.
Oh.
Variation is on the map is negative,
Uh-huh.
but your compass will have its own deviation.
oh, okay,
And that's one of those gotcha things.
Yeah,
Deviation,
right.
variation.
yeah,
Kind of mean the same thing.
yeah.
VFR approaches to land at night should be accomplished. A higher speed, a steeper descent, the same as daytime. Now, you look at this question, you go, well, it's talking about safety things or something like that, maybe. But you actually got to break down the actual question. Approaches at night should be accomplished.
It should be, air temperature should be cooler
Well, no, it's to say nighttime. You land faster at night with a steeper descent, or should you land exactly the same as you do during the daytime?
C,
Correctly? You would think, oh, well, that maybe higher airspeed is a safety thing, and that question's kind of oriented maybe at a safety thing, but that would be wrong. Greatest vortex strength occurs in the generating aircraft is. Come on, we saw it 2 minutes ago.
yeah,
A.
anything's C,
And it's going to kind of disagree with this answer, but the right answer is C. So,
But A is really the most right.
yeah, it's wrong. You said that video when the airplane's in a takeoff configuration, and that's what he means by clean is gear up and flaps up. But when he's taking off, the gear is down and the flaps are down.
oh,
They will come up, but when he's closest to the runway, he's dirty. So
Oh, wow.
that's kind of one of those questions. I actually got this wrong when I took this together.
Yeah, I got it.
Deviation of the magnetic compass is caused by, you know this one.
C,
Anyone else have anything else?
B.
B. Aiden says B. Anybody else have?
oh, geez.
B. Good answer. Yeah. So the radio's on and all the equipment in the airplane can affect the compass. So that's why that little card you'll see next to the compass in each airplane is calibrated to that specific airplane. So when all the radios are on that, it makes enough RF noise that throws that compass off, and that's what we measure. That's what we put on that little card. One in-flight condition necessary for structural icing to form is. There we
A.
said we need what for ice?
Moisture. Heat.
Good answer, yes. Good answer. That documents must be in your personal possession or readily accessible in the aircraft when operating as pilot in command. Well, we talked about the documents that you need to have in the airplane, the airworthiness, the registration, and operating limitations. But this is personal possession for the pilot. Well, okay, let's go through these. Let's see. Certificate showing accomplishment of a checkout in the aircraft. What's a checkout in the aircraft? It's not really an FAA thing. That's a rental or insurance requirement. If you go rent my airplane, you need to be checked out and make sure you're okay. When you rent,
Well, that's for each
Prices are-
flight then. You do that before each flight.
no, a checkout would be you and me would go fly in the airplane, and once I determined that you were current and good in the airplane, then I could let you go fly the airplane on your own type of thing. That'd be a checkout. It's not really an FAA requirement. The FAA requirement is your flight review. I don't know if we talked about. We talked a little bit about currency requirements for a pilot, your medical certificate, and your buying a flight review. So flight review is correct, and logbook showing recency of experience, you're not really required to have in your possession in your logbook. This one says appropriate pilot certificate and current medical certificate. Yeah, you need to appropriate pilot certificate. You know, flying a multi-engine airplane, you have to have a multi-engine certificate to fly that airplane, and a copy of your medical certificate, if required. If you're a basic med or it's a light sport airplane, you don't need a medical certificate, and you don't need to have it with you. Based on that, I'd say C. I don't know, so you're right next. During flight, when are the indications of magnetic compass accurate? Straight and level flight, as long as the airspeed is constant, or during turns if the bank does not exceed 18 degrees. Yeah. Unaccelerated flight. A. This just sounds super technical, but doesn't mean anything. Right? That's a gotcha kind of answer. When are non-rechargeable batteries of an emergency locator transmitter required to be replaced? We talked about that in the second week. The ELT is a little gizmo that goes in the airplane, so if you crash, it's got a little alert and it transmits on a frequency that search and rescue can use to track in on you. And it has to be inspected every 12 months. And when 50% of the useful life of the battery has expired, you need to replace the battery. So if you bump it and it goes off, you could turn it off and say, well, it hasn't used 50% of the battery. We don't really know that because you got to go measure the batteries and there's not information on it, so you just change the batteries anytime. They do get inspected at each 100-hour annual inspection, but the question is, batteries be replaced? Doesn't mean that. So no, the correct answer is B. What minimum pilot certification is required for operation within Class B airspace? We went over that last week. Say B, private pilot certificate or student pilot with appropriate logbook endorsement. Anybody else? Different answer? Yeah. The term angle of attack is defined as the angle between what? I know I beat this into you guys. Just let you go. What is angle of attack?
I'm gonna go for B. Bravo, I mean.
Okay, what do you say?
C.
C. Man. Come on.
One
right
other,
answer.
there's one other option.
Chord line?
No, I haven't heard that yet.
Yeah. Chord line. There's our wing. Chord line is actually chord line is longest part of the wing. Don't forget this. What is the purpose of runway hold position sign? So, we didn't really talk about this. So you shouldn't know the answer. So let's figure out. So you got this question on the test and you have no idea, but you still gotta get it right. Runway. Maybe 2 runways? Intersecting runways maybe? That's not pretty good. So let's see. Denotes entrance to a runway from a taxiway. I'm not going to say anything about taxiway here. Denotes an area protected for an aircraft approaching or departing a runway. But it said runway/runway. So I would go with that. Do y'all agree?
C.
Okay. Any questions? Got what time you got?
After 8.
That took me a lot longer to write all those questions. Yeah, one fun video. No.
In the first qualifying session of race 4 in Windsor, Ontario, Australian pilot Matt Hall, after a strong early section in the track, stalled his plane to face a dramatic situation.
Anybody ever watch this level area?
Left to the chicane.
Oh! And a skin off the water! What an amazing recovery! Matt Hall! Way too low! Skimming the wing in the water, but just pulls the plane up in time.
Cleared all 3. Just have a look at your talking.
A truly amazing recovery, split-second decisions, and true skill to bring his MXSR plane back safely to the race airport.
I came through the gate 13, I believe it is, with too great an angle to the chicane, and then I broke one of my own rules. I actually looked into the turn, which means I don't fly the aircraft naturally. I pulled on it. I've G-stalled the aircraft, which has rolled me slightly past the knife edge. I managed to get it back to wings level and recover. I believe I might have skipped twice on the water because I felt 2 impacts, flew it away, and then obviously it was all just trying just to get it back on the ground safely. Everyone was okay.
Matt Hall's experience and perhaps military training allow him to stay safe in this situation, as others confirm the same feeling.
Yeah, you know, thank God it was Matt Hall. There's a guy that was pushing hard, stalled the airplane, and he's one of the best pilots on the planet. And that's why he is where he is now, landing back safely at this airport.
Unfortunately, Team Hall were unable to prepare the MXSR for race action today, but we will see the Australian pilots at the next race on the Red Bull Air Race in New York City, USA.
The main damage is probably on the right aileron, has been split, and the wingtip. So as long as the main spar and the engine attachment points are okay, I think the plane is actually not that badly damaged, and it's going to be a matter of replacing parts rather than replacing large components.
The World Championship point in qualifying went to Nigel Lamb for the first time in his career. And after these dramatic events and amazing flying by all of the pilots, today's race promises to be one of the most exciting of the season so far.
All right, that's all I got for you guys. No class next week, 4th of July, the Monday.
Right.
So I think it's the last class on the 11th.
Put together some flight plans.
Yeah, we'll do practice tests and flight plans, and you got whatever questions you can come up with, you know, or stuff that you don't get. We'll just go through all that kind of stuff.
Everybody have your email address to ask you questions?
Yep, you got my email. I got questions, and call, text, whatever. Yeah. Hopefully it won't be too hot. Cooled off nicely, yeah.
do. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, bunch of magazines here. Take whatever you want.
Oh, thanks.
We're not gonna flight training. This is a bunch of stupid stuff. What else you got?